Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Welcome to the shadow of marriage. There is a specific moment that women describe to me with a consistency that, after years of clinical practice, I have come to recognize as one of the most reliable signs that something important is happening in a marriage. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no argument, no confrontation, no event with clean enough edges to be examined and addressed. It is simply the moment when a woman realizes with a certainty that arrives before she has the words for it, that the man she is married to has gone somewhere she cannot follow. He is still there, physically present, functionally engaged, moving through the shared life with the competence and reliability that she has always been able to count on. But something has changed in the quality of his presence. Something in the space between them has shifted, and the silence that has settled into that space is not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well enough not to need constant conversation. It is a different kind of silence, a silence with weight, a silence that feels in the specific and unsettling way of things that matter and are not being addressed, like a message she cannot quite decode. In my years of working with couples in various stages of marital crisis and emotional disconnection, I have heard this moment described hundreds of times, always in slightly different language, always in slightly different circumstances, but always with the same essential quality of disorientation. The woman who comes to me not with a complaint, she can articulate precisely but with a feeling she cannot dismiss, the feeling that her husband has gone silent in a way that is not about words, that the silence is not the absence of conversation but the presence of something else, something unspoken and heavy, and she suspects with a dread she has been trying not to feel, significant. What I want to do in this video is decode that silence, not in the simplistic way that relationship content tends to approach it, not with a list of what silence means and what to do about it, but with the clinical and psychological specificity that actually helps. Because male silence in marriage is not one thing, it is many things, and understanding which kind of silence you are living with, what it is actually communicating, where it comes from, and what the path toward genuine engagement with it actually looks like, is the difference between a response that opens something and a response that closes it further. If you are watching this and the opening of this video has named something you have been living with, if the description of the silence with weight, the presence that is somehow also an absence, the husband who is there and not there, landed somewhere real, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on notifications, because this series goes somewhere that most relationship content does not reach, and every video builds on the last. What we are building here is a body of understanding that is grounded in real clinical experience and genuine psychological science, and that is offered with the sincere hope that it reaches the people who need it most. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Anna. Anna was 39 years old when she first came to see me. She had been married for 12 years to a man named James, an architect, thoughtful by temperament, the kind of man who built things carefully and who had, in the early years of their marriage, brought that same quality of careful attention to the relationship. He had been, Anna said, a man she could talk to, not just about the logistics of their shared life, the children, the house, the finances, but about the things that mattered beneath the logistics, about what he was thinking, what he was worried about, what he found beautiful or troubling or worth paying attention to. There had been a quality to their early conversations that she described, with a longing that was entirely present tense, as the feeling of being genuinely met, of saying something and having it received by someone who was actually listening, not performing listening, not waiting for his turn, but actually there, actually interested, actually engaged with what she was offering. That quality had changed. Not suddenly, she could not point to a moment when it had stopped, but gradually, over the course of approximately 3 years, the conversations had shifted. Not in content, exactly. They still talked, still covered the ground of their shared life, still had exchanges that would look, from the outside, like the normal communication of a functioning couple. But the quality of his presence in those conversations had changed. The listening had become something more managed, more careful in a different way than before. Careful in the sense of controlled, of monitored, of a man who was choosing his responses rather than simply having them. The spontaneity had gone. The sense of genuine exchange had been replaced by something that felt to Anna like the performance of exchange, like a man who was going through the motions of conversation while actually being somewhere else. And then, over the past year, even the performance had diminished. James had become quieter, not withdrawn in the dramatic sense, not cold or hostile or conspicuously absent, but quieter in the specific, steady, accumulating way that a person becomes quiet when they have stopped expecting conversation to produce anything worth the effort. He answered questions. He responded when spoken to, but he no longer initiated. He no longer brought anything to the space between them of his own accord. The silence had become the default, and the silence had weight. Anna had responded to this silence in the way that most women respond, by talking more. By filling the space that his retreat had opened with her own presence, her own words, her own attempts to recreate the quality of exchange she was missing. She had asked more questions. She had tried to draw him out, to find the topic or the moment or the quality of approach that would produce the James she had married rather than the James who sat across from her at dinner and said the right things in the careful, managed, going through the motions way that she had come to dread. She had tried directness, asking him explicitly what was wrong, whether he was unhappy, whether something had happened that she did not know about. She had tried indirectness, creating the conditions she believed were most likely to produce genuine engagement. The quiet evenings, the walks, the moments without the children, and without the logistical agenda of their shared life. Nothing had produced what she was looking for, and the silence had continued to grow. Carl Jung dizia que tudo que não tornamos consciente aparece em nossa vida como destino, and in James's silence, something was operating from exactly that place, from below the level of conscious intention, from the territory of the unexamined and the unprocessed, shaping the dynamic between them in ways that neither of them fully understood. And what I want to do with the rest of this video is take you inside that territory, to explain, with the psychological precision that clinical work makes possible, what male silence in marriage actually is, where it comes from, and what the range of things it might be communicating in a specific marriage like Anna and James's. The first thing I want to establish, and I want to establish it clearly because it changes everything about how a woman responds to this silence, is that male silence in marriage is almost never what it appears to be from the outside. It does not appear from the outside as a complex psychological phenomenon with specific roots and specific meanings and specific pathways toward resolution. It appears from the outside as the absence of communication, as the failure or refusal to engage, as something passive, something defined by what is not happening rather than by what is. And because it appears passive, it tends to be responded to with escalation, with more talking, more asking, more direct confrontation, more attempts to make something happen in a space where the primary feature seems to be the absence of happening. But male silence in marriage is not passive. It is active. It is doing something. And what it is doing, what it is communicating, below the level of words and often below the level of the man's own conscious awareness, is one of several things that require very different responses. The first and most common form of male silence is what I call the overload silence. This is the silence of a man who has reached the limit of his emotional processing capacity and has gone quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because what he has to say is beyond his current ability to say it. This is grounded in a well-documented difference in how male and female nervous systems process emotional information, a difference that is not absolute and not universal, but that is real enough and consistent enough to be clinically significant. Research in neuropsychology suggests that men's nervous systems tend to reach a state called emotional flooding, a state of physiological overwhelm in which the higher cognitive functions required for articulate emotional communication become genuinely inaccessible at lower thresholds and with greater frequency than women's. John Gottman's decades of research on couples documented this with particular clarity. Male partners in distressed marriages show higher baseline levels of physiological arousal during conflict, reach flooding more quickly, and take longer to recover from it. And the primary behavioral response to flooding, in both genders but more consistently in men, is withdrawal. Going quiet, creating distance until the nervous system can regulate itself sufficiently to re-engage. This is important clinical information for a woman who is responding to her husband's silence with increased pursuit, with more talking, more asking, more direct attempts to produce engagement, because the increased pursuit, however well-intentioned, tends to produce the exact opposite of the engagement it is seeking. It increases the arousal that has already exceeded the man's processing capacity. It pushes him further into the flooding state. It deepens the silence rather than interrupting it. And it creates, around the silence, a secondary dynamic, the pursuer-distancer pattern that Gottman identified as one of the most reliably destructive cycles in intimate relationships, in which her pursuit and his distance reinforce each other in a self-perpetuating loop that becomes, over time, the dominant emotional architecture of the marriage. Maybe this is already landing somewhere real for you. Maybe you are recognizing in the description of Anna's escalating attempts to draw James out and James's deepening retreat, a dynamic that has a familiar shape in your own marriage. If so, stay with that recognition. Because the path out of the pursuer-distancer dynamic requires, first and most fundamentally, the willingness to understand the silence rather than simply to respond to it. And understanding it begins with the honest acknowledgement that the silence is not the problem. The silence is the symptom. And the symptom is communicating something that the man in question does not yet have the internal resources to communicate in words. The second form of male silence is what I call the protective silence. This is more complex than the overload silence and more difficult to address, because it is not simply the result of reaching an emotional capacity limit. It is the result of a decision, not necessarily a conscious decision, but a decision nonetheless. that the emotional territory of the marriage is not safe enough to enter without armor, that the vulnerability required for genuine emotional exchange carries a risk that, from inside his particular psychological history, feels greater than the benefit of the exchange. This form of silence is almost always rooted in early experience, in the environment in which he learned, before he had any language for what he was learning, what emotional expression produced. For some men, it produced withdrawal from the people they needed most. For others, it produced conflict or contempt, or the particular shame that comes from being told, in the ways that children are told these things without words, that feelings are weakness, and weakness is not safe. And for others still, it produced nothing, an absence of response, a blankness in the people they brought their inner life to, that taught them that the inner life was not worth bringing. James's history, as it emerged across our sessions, contained all three elements in varying proportions. His father had been a man of accomplished silence, competent, reliable, by every functional measure a good father, and almost entirely inaccessible in the emotional sense. Not cold exactly, not unkind, simply not there, in the way that matters for a child's developing understanding of what intimacy is and what it is safe to offer in a close relationship. James had grown up with a sophisticated capacity for functional engagement and an almost complete absence of the experience of emotional exchange as something that produces connection rather than risk. He had learned in the wordless and pre-rational way that these things are always learned, that what he felt was his business, that bringing it to another person, making himself visible in the specific exposed way that genuine emotional communication requires, was not something the environment had shown him was safe or productive or worth the cost. And this learning had followed him, as all early learning follows us, into the intimate relationships of his adult life. Not as a conscious philosophy, not as a choice he was making about Anna specifically. As an automatic operating system, the deeply encoded expectation that emotional expression in close relationships produces not connection, but some version of the risk he had learned to associate with it. And when the marriage had entered the territory of genuine difficulty, when the distance between them had grown significant enough that emotional communication was not just potentially vulnerable, but actually necessary, the automatic operating system had engaged, the armor had gone up, the silence had become the default. There is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in the most honest therapeutic work, and it is the layer that changes everything when it finally becomes visible. Because the protective silence is not simply about the man's history, it is also, always, about the specific dynamic of the marriage, about what he has learned through the accumulated experience of emotional exchange in this particular relationship to expect when he tries to be vulnerable here. And sometimes, not always, and I want to be careful about how I say this because it is not a way of distributing blame. What he has learned from the experience of trying to be vulnerable in the marriage is that the attempt will be met with something that does not feel safe, with anxiety that amplifies his own, with a response organized around her need rather than his offering, with the specific painful experience of reaching out and finding that the space he reached into was already occupied by something that could not receive him. This is the most important thing to understand about the second form of male silence. It is not only his armor, it is also his response to the emotional weather of the marriage. And the emotional weather of the marriage is something that both people create together through the accumulated history of how they have responded to each other's vulnerability, which means that addressing it requires not just understanding his history, but honestly examining the specific ways in which the dynamic between them has contributed to making his silence the safest available option. I want to pause here and say something directly about what this means for Anna, and for every woman watching who is living inside the silence I have been describing. Because what I just said can be heard as blame, and that is not how I mean it. I mean it as information. As the honest, clinically grounded recognition that a marriage is a system, and systems do not have a single cause. The silence did not come from nowhere. It came from a history, his, hers, and theirs together, and understanding that history with the specificity that allows genuine change is the only thing that actually interrupts the dynamic rather than simply managing it. If you have been living inside this silence and you are ready to understand it rather than simply endure it, if something in this video is landing in a way that produces recognition rather than just information, I want you to know that the ebook that accompanies this channel was designed for exactly this moment, not for the moment of crisis necessarily, for the moment of genuine desire to understand what is actually happening and to address it with the clarity and the structured guidance that makes change possible rather than simply desirable. The link is in the description. I will return to it. But stay with me, because what comes next is the part that most videos on this topic never reach. Aqui está a parte 2, continuação e conclusão. The third form of male silence is the one that is most difficult to name and most important to understand clearly, because it is the form that carries the most clinical weight and the most potential for genuine harm if it is misread. I call it the resignation silence, and it is different from the overload silence and the protective silence in one essential way. It is not the silence of a man who is overwhelmed and needs time to regulate, or the silence of a man who is protecting himself from a vulnerability that feels unsafe. It is the silence of a man who has, at some level below conscious articulation, stopped believing that the marriage is a place where genuine connection is still possible. Who has not left, not in body, not in the functional sense, not in any way that would be visible from the outside, but who has, quietly and without announcement, emotionally departed. Who is going through the motions with the specific quality of someone who has made a private peace with the gap between what the marriage is and what he once hoped it would be. This is the silence that Jung's insight about the unconscious speaks to most directly, because the resignation silence is almost never a conscious decision. The man living inside it has not decided to give up. He has arrived at giving up through a process so gradual and so below the threshold of conscious awareness that he himself often does not know it has happened. What he knows is that he feels tired in a way that sleep does not resolve, that the effort of trying to bridge the distance between them has, at some point he cannot precisely identify, begun to cost more than it returns. That the specific hope that used to pull him toward her, the hope of genuine meeting, of being known, of the particular aliveness that genuine, intimate connection produces, has become quiet enough that he no longer reaches for it automatically. The resignation silence is the silence that Anna was living with, not the overload silence of a man who needed space to regulate, not the protective silence of a man who was afraid of what vulnerability would cost him. The resignation silence of a man who had been trying, in the specific and limited ways available to him, given his history and his emotional vocabulary, to bridge the distance between them, and who had, across the accumulation of years of trying, without the tools to try effectively, quietly stopped. James did not know this about himself when I first began working with Anna. He had not arrived at a conscious assessment of the marriage as beyond repair or his investment in it as finished. What he had arrived at was a kind of numbness, a flattening of the emotional register of the marriage into something manageable and sustainable, and entirely devoid of the aliveness that both of them had once experienced in it. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of something that had been turned down so low for so long that neither of them could quite remember what it had sounded like at full volume. What I want to say about the resignation silence, and what I want to say carefully, because it is the kind of truth that is easy to hear as hopelessness, and that I do not intend as hopelessness, is that it is the most serious of the three forms and the one that requires the most urgent and the most honest response. Not because it is irreversible. It is not irreversible, and I have seen marriages come back from precisely this place with a quality of genuine reconnection that surprised both people. But because the window within which that return is possible is not infinite, and because the response that the resignation silence most requires, which is honesty, genuine and specific and undefended honesty, from both people about what has been happening and what it has cost, is also the response that is most difficult to produce when the emotional weather of the marriage has been the specific flatness and managed distance that the resignation silence generates. Anna came to this understanding slowly and with considerable resistance, in the way that all genuinely important clinical insights arrive. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradually increasing pressure of recognition that eventually becomes impossible to continue deflecting. The recognition in her case was this: she had been responding to James's silence as though it were a problem he was having that she needed to help him solve, as though the silence were his and the solution were in her hands if she could only find the right approach, the right moment, the right quality of invitation. And this framing, however understandable, however much it expressed the genuine love she had for him, had been for 3 years keeping her from the only response that had any real chance of reaching him. The response that had a real chance of reaching him was not more skillful pursuit. It was honest presence, the willingness to be in a single conversation, as genuinely and specifically and undefendedly real as she wanted him to be, to bring into the space between them not the management of the distance but the honest acknowledgement of it. Not the attempt to recreate the early warmth through the right circumstances or the right approach, but the willingness to name, out loud and without the careful management that had characterized her communication with him for years, what the distance had cost her, not as an accusation, not as a demand, as the specific, vulnerable, entirely human truth of a woman who missed her husband and was no longer willing to pretend she did not. This is the pivot point in the clinical work with this kind of silence, and I want to describe it precisely because it is frequently misunderstood. The honest presence I am describing is not the same as the direct confrontation that the pursuer in the pursuer-distancer dynamic tends to eventually attempt. The conversation that has been building for months of managed frustration and that arrives already organized around the history of failed attempts and the accumulated weight of everything that has gone unsaid. That conversation is not honest presence. It is the explosion of managed emotion, and it tends to produce in the distancer the defensive closure that it has always produced: Honest presence is different. It is the specific, contained, genuinely vulnerable offering of what is actually true in this moment, not the catalog of everything that has been wrong, not the summary of all the ways he has failed to show up, but the single clean, undefended statement of what she is experiencing right now, what she is missing, what it is like to be her, in this marriage, in this moment of distance that has gone on long enough to need naming. The conversation Anna eventually had with James happened on a Tuesday evening in November, approximately 3 months into our work together. She had not planned it. It had not been scheduled or prepared or rehearsed. What had happened was simpler than any of that. She had been sitting across from him at the dinner table after the children were in bed, watching him in the specific way she had developed over 3 years of trying to read the silence, and something in her had simply stopped managing, stopped trying to decode, stopped the internal calculation of approach and timing and the right way to reach him, and into that stopping, something honest had arrived. She looked at him and she said, "I miss you. Not I miss the way things used to be, or I miss what we had, or the framing of any of the other attempts she had made to name the distance from a position of careful management. Just, I miss you. Present tense, specific, addressed to him rather than to the marriage or the history or the situation." James looked up from his plate, and he was quiet for a moment, not the managed, going elsewhere quiet of the resignation silence, but a different quality of quiet. The quiet of someone who has been reached somewhere he had stopped expecting to be reached. And then he said something that Anna told me, in our next session, had landed in her like the first genuinely real thing he had said in years. He said, "I didn't think you noticed. 4 words. Not the beginning of the conversation that resolved everything. That conversation did not happen in a single evening, and the work that followed it was long and required support beyond what the 2 of them could provide for each other alone. But 4 words that cracked something open, that moved the silence from the resignation of someone who has privately concluded that he is invisible in his own marriage into something more available, more uncertain, more alive with the specific, fragile possibility of genuine exchange. What those 4 words revealed, and what the work that followed them gradually made visible, was something that I want to explain carefully, because it is one of the most consistently surprising and most clinically important things I encounter in this kind of work. James's silence had not been, as Anna had experienced it, the withdrawal of a man who no longer cared. It had been, in its own distorted and deeply unhelpful way, a form of care, a form of protection, not of himself, as the protective silence is, but of the marriage. He had gone quiet because the things he might have said about his own sense of failure in the marriage, about the specific ways he felt he had been trying and not landing, about the loneliness of being in a relationship where he did not feel seen, felt to him like threats, like the kind of honesty that would damage something rather than repair it. And so he had managed them. He had kept them below the surface. He had maintained the silence as a way of not saying the things he feared would make everything worse. This is the paradox at the heart of the resignation silence. And it is the paradox that honest presence, the specific, vulnerable, undefended offering of what is actually true, is uniquely equipped to interrupt. Because the resignation silence is maintained by the mutual agreement, never spoken and often not conscious, to protect the marriage from the honesty that the marriage most needs, Both people are managing. Both people are keeping something below the surface. Both people are, in their different ways, trying to preserve something by not saying the thing that is most true. And the result of this mutual management is the specific, deadening, ultimately unsustainable dynamic that the resignation silence produces. A marriage that feels safe from the wrong things and genuinely threatened by the right ones. The practices I want to offer in the final part of this video are grounded in what the clinical work with Anna and James, and with the many couples whose marriages have contained some version of this silence, has taught me about what actually interrupts it, not the management of it, not the skillful pursuit of engagement, the genuine interruption of the dynamic that maintains it. The first practice is what I call the temperature check, a brief, regular, explicitly non-loaded moment of genuine inquiry that is different from the loaded questions that the silence tends to generate. Not how are you or is everything okay, which tend to produce the managed responses of a man who has learned that those questions are not really asking what they appear to ask, but something more specific and more genuinely curious. Something like, what has been on your mind this week that you haven't said out loud? Not as a demand, as a genuine question from someone who is actually curious about the answer and is prepared to receive it without immediately converting it into material for the management of the relationship. The power of the temperature check is not in the question itself, but in the quality of attention that accompanies it. The quality that communicates, before a single word is spoken in response, that the answer will be received rather than evaluated, that what he brings to the space will be met with genuine interest rather than the specific, well-intentioned but ultimately conversation-closing response of a person who is listening in order to know how to respond, rather than simply in order to understand. The second practice is what I call the equal vulnerability, the deliberate, regular offering of something genuinely true about your own inner experience that is not organized around the marriage or his behavior or the state of your connection. Something from your own life that is real and that you are bringing not because it requires a response, but because you are choosing to be genuinely present in this relationship rather than managing it. Not I have been feeling disconnected from you, which is true, but which carries within it the implicit request for something from him. But I have been thinking about something and I want to tell you. Something from your own interior life that is worth sharing because it is yours, not because it is designed to produce a particular response. The equal vulnerability practice is important because it changes the emotional weather of the exchange in a way that unilateral pursuit cannot. It communicates through action rather than through words that genuine presence is safe here, that bringing something real to this space does not result in it being managed or evaluated or converted into a conversation about the relationship. It creates, through repetition, the specific experience of mutual exposure that genuine intimacy requires. The experience of two people who are both willing to be visible, both willing to be known, both choosing presence over management in the same moment. The third practice is the one that requires the most courage and produces, in my clinical experience, the most significant shifts in the dynamic of the resignation silence. I call it the honest question, the single, specific, genuinely curious question about his experience that is not a demand disguised as a question and not an accusation wearing the clothes of curiosity. Something like, what would make it easier for you to talk to me? Or, is there something I do that makes it harder for you to be here with me? Not asked from the position of managed hurt or accumulated frustration. asked from the position of genuine desire to understand, the recognition that his silence is communicating something real, and that she wants to understand what it is because she wants him, not because she wants the marriage to function better. The honest question is different from the direct confrontation in one essential way. It is organized around curiosity about him rather than around the communication of her need, and that difference, which sounds small, produces in the man receiving it a fundamentally different experience. The direct confrontation, however lovingly intended, tends to arrive as evidence that the emotional weather of the exchange is already organized around her experience, that the space between them is already occupied by something he needs to navigate rather than something he can simply be in. The honest question asked from genuine curiosity creates a different kind of space, a space that is, however briefly and however tentatively, actually available for him to enter. James entered it, gradually and imperfectly, and with the specific hesitancy of a man who had spent years learning that the space was not safe. But he entered it, and what he brought, when he began to bring things, was not what Anna had expected. It was not a catalogue of her failures or a summary of his dissatisfactions. It was something more human and more difficult and more genuinely moving than any of that. It was the specific, particular loneliness of a man who had been trying to love his wife well and had not known how, and who had gone quiet not because he had stopped caring, but because the caring had become, in the absence of the tools to express it effectively, indistinguishable from loss. This is what male silence in marriage almost always contains when it is finally reached and examined honestly. Not indifference, not the absence of love, the presence of love without adequate expression. Love that has been trying to find its way into the space between two people and has been failing for reasons that neither of them fully understands to arrive. The silence is not the end of the love. It is what the love looks like when it has run out of language, and the recovery of language, genuine, specific, unmanaged emotional language between two people who have been living in managed distance, is the most important and most demanding work a marriage can undertake. It requires more than good intention. It requires the specific, structured, clinically grounded guidance that makes it possible to move from understanding what is happening to actually changing it. This is what the ebook was built to support. It contains the full framework for all three practices I described: the temperature check, the equal vulnerability, and the honest question, with detailed guidance for each stage of the process. It contains specific language for the conversation that Anna had with James, the moment of honest presence that cracked the silence open, and a structured path for what comes after that moment, when the crack is there, but the work of widening it into genuine exchange has only just begun. And it contains a section specifically for the woman whose husband's silence has reached the resignation stage, whose marriage is living in the specific flatness that I described earlier, with the honest, specific, clinically grounded guidance for what that stage requires and what it makes possible when it is addressed with the right understanding and the right tools. The link is in the description. If you have been living inside the silence I described in this video, if the weight of it, the quality of it, the specific disorientation of a man who is there and not there has been the dominant emotional weather of your marriage, this is the next step. Not because the ebook will resolve everything, but because the work of resolution requires structure, and structure requires starting somewhere specific rather than simply understanding the problem more clearly and waiting for something to change. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this series continues and the next video goes somewhere this one did not. We are building together a body of understanding about what actually happens in marriages. Not what the surface presents, but what the psychology beneath the surface is doing, and what bringing it into conscious awareness makes possible that was not possible before. Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. James's silence was not fate. It was psychology. It was the accumulated expression of a history he had never fully examined, operating in the space between him and the woman he loved, producing a distance that neither of them had chosen and that both of them had the capacity to close, not instantly, not without the real and sustained work that genuine repair always requires, but genuinely and with lasting effect. When the silence was finally understood rather than simply endured, your husband's silence is not fate either. It is a message. And like all messages that have been waiting too long to be received, it deserves to be heard with the full, honest, courageous attention that you have been waiting for him to bring to you. The silence has been asking for something, not from you exactly, from both of you, from the marriage that both of you are still, in your different ways and with your different silences and your different forms of managed distance, choosing every day simply by continuing to be in it. There is still something there. In most of the marriages I have sat with that contain this silence, there is still something there. Beneath the resignation, beneath the flatness, beneath the years of trying without the tools to try effectively. Something that has not yet spoken its last word. Something that is still waiting, with the patient persistence of anything genuinely real, for the honest presence that will finally give it language. The shadow has been running your marriage long enough. It is time to bring it into the light. Welcome to the shadow of marriage, and welcome to the beginning of genuine understanding.